In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at type checking. There are currently three modes for type checking. There is the no check, non-strict, and strict mode. Currently, the default mode is non-check, but we can make non-strict the default mode by enabling it inside of beta features. So to do this, we can go to File, Beta Features, and if we enable scripts are non-strict by default, then now non-strict will be the default mode. But if we don't enable this beta feature, then the default will be no check. Another way of setting the type checking mode is to create the script, and then we can copy one of the modes to the top of the script. For instance, if we want the script to use no check-in, I can copy this to the top of the script. And now this script is going to be in no check mode. But if I, for instance, want the script to be in non-strict mode, I can copy this and put it at the top like this. And now this script is going to be in non-strict mode. Let me now try to explain the difference between non-strict mode and strict mode. So if I first create a variable, so if I say local x equals 5, and then if I try to change the type of this variable from a number to a string, so if I say x equals hello, we can see that we get no warnings. But if I change to strict mode, we can now see that we get a warning, and if we hover our mouse over the warning, it says type string could not be converted into number. So the reason this is happening is if we place our mouse on top of the x variable, we can see a little pop-up that says number, and that is because when in strict mode, it's going to infer what this variable is by the value we provide. So for instance, if I change this to a string and place my mouse over x again, we can now see it says string instead of number. But if we go back to non-strict mode and we place our mouse on top of x again, now we can see instead of being a string, it's now a type of any. And when it's a type of any, it will no longer produce an error because x can be any type. For instance, if I set x to 5 and we mouse over x, we can still see it's a type of any, and that's why it's no longer producing a warning when we try to change the type to a string. And because the type of x is not going to be inferred on non-strict mode, what we must do is, in order to set the type of x, is to manually assign the type. And to do this, all we need to do is use a colon, and here we get a list of types, and I'm going to set it to the number type. So now, if we mouse over x, we can see it now says number, even though we're in non-strict mode. At the current time of making this video, type checking has no effect in game. So here we can see we're setting the incorrect type to x. And if we even print x, and if we run the game, we can see that we don't get any errors and it prints out x correctly as hello. So even though we have type checking in our scripts, it has no effect in game. So the main purpose of type checking is to help us not make mistakes while scripting. For instance, let's say I created a function, and this function is going to take in a parameter called y, and this is going to be a type of string. And let's say I now call this function, and let's say I make a mistake by passing in the x variable into this function. So here we can see we're getting a warning, and if I place my mouse over the warning, it says type number could not be converted into string, and that is because x is a number while y needs to be a string. So if I change x to a string, so I can say string and change this to a string, like so. Now we can see that the warning goes away and we're calling the function correctly. Let's now assume that you're working with a group of developers and you have been assigned a role to create a custom vector-free module. So let's create a brand new module and let's call this module vector-free. And let's create a new function for this module called new. And this function is going to take in 3 numbers. So it's going to take in the number of x, and we're going to give it the type of number, and y with the type of number, and z with the type of number. And inside of this new function, all I'm going to do is create a table called vector3, and I'm going to set the x key of the vector3 table to the x number that we pass into the function, and the same for the y key, and a z key for the z number. And finally, I'm going to return the vector3 table back to whoever called the new function. Let's now assume that someone else in your team must create a pet module script, which is going to use your vector3 script in order to store the position of the pet. So let's create a new module script, and I'm going to name the script as pet. And at the very top, I'm going to require the vector3 module script. So I'm going to say local v3 equals require game.server_storage vector3. And just like the vector3 module, let's create a function called new. And this function is going to create a table called pet. And this pet table is going to have a key called position. So pet.position equals, and we're going to use the v3 module to create the vector3 object. So I'm going to say v3.new, and this is going to require 3 numbers. So we're going to set the pet to start at position 0, 0, 0. And finally, we're going to return the pet object, like so. And just like in scripts, we can also set the type checking mode inside of modules as well. So at the top of this script, I'm going to set the type checking mode to non-strict. And I'm also going to do the same for our vector3 module. And because now this pet module is now in non-strict mode, if we made a mistake and instead of setting z to a number, we set z to a string, we will get a warning saying that this is the incorrect type. Even though we've set up the types for the x, y, and z parameters of the new function, we have not set up the types for the vector3 table and for the pet table. So what this means is, if I try to change the pet's position, so if I say pet.position.x equals, and instead of setting this to a number, if I set this to a string, we see we don't get no warning. So the reason for this is if we mouse over the pet variable, we can see that it's a table with a position key that is of type any. And if we mouse over the vector3, we can see that this is a table with 3 keys, x, y, and z, and each key can be of type any. So this x key can be of any type, including a string, and so we're not getting an error. So a quick way to fix this problem would be to simply change the type mode to strict. So if we change the vector3 to strict, and we now mouse over vector3, we can see that it's able to infer that the x, y, and z keys are numbers because the x, y, and z parameters are also numbers. And if we come over here and change this to strict, and we mouse over pet, we can now see it's able to see that position is a table with X, Y, and Z keys as numbers, and we now get a warning. But if you wanted to use non-strict, let's see how we could fix this problem using non-strict. So let's now first fix the vector-free table. So instead of having X, Y, and Z equal to any type, let's set them to be a number type. So you may think that we must do this to set the type, but this is not correct. We must set the type when we define the variable. So in order to find the X, Y, and Z as number types, over here, we can say is equal to a table. And inside of this table, we're going to have a X key, which is of type number. We're going to have a Y key, which is of type number. And we're going to have a Z key, which is of type number. So now that we've set the types for the X, Y, and Z keys, we're receiving a different warning. And if we mouse over, this warning is saying that this table is missing the X, Y, and Z keys. So this table is not compatible with this type because this type requires a X, Y, and Z key, which are numbers. And this table doesn't have an X, Y, and Z key that are numbers. So one way to fix this problem would be to put a question mark next to number. And what this is going to do is going to allow X, Y, and Z to be either nil or a number. So when we place a question mark next to the type, it's going to allow the value to be either nil or a number type. So now, because this table has the X, Y, and Z as nil, which is allowed because we added question marks, it's going to allow X, Y, and Z to either be a number, or it's also going to allow the X, Y, and Z to be equal to nil. But I don't want this because I don't want X to ever be equal to nil. So let's remove the question mark. And now X should never be able to be set to nil. And so now we have the same warning as before because X, Y, and Z can no longer be nil. So we must add X, Y, and Z into this table when we set the vector-free variable. So inside of this table, I'm going to say X equals 0, Y equals 0, Z equals 0. And now the warning message has gone away. Another thing we could do is remove this altogether and set X, Y, and Z directly in like this. And so now if we mouse over vector-free, we can see it says X is a type of number, Y is a type of number, and Z is a type of number. But even though our vector-free is now set up correctly, we still are able to set the X variable to a string on our pet script. And that is because if we mouse over the pet table, we can still see that position is equal to any type. So let's now fix our pet variable. So I'm going to set this to a type of table. And inside of this table is going to be a key called position. And this position key is going to be of type table. And this table is going to have a X, Y, and Z numbers. So I can just simply copy and paste this over here because it's going to be the same as over there. And now we have the same warning like we did over this side, and that is because this table is not compatible with this type. So what we need to do, just like we did here, is inside of this table, add the position key, like so. And now we can see that we are getting a warning for the string on the X key. And if I set the X key to a number instead, we can see that the warning goes away. Okay, so now that everything seems to be working fine, there's one last problem we must fix. And that is that the type that this function returns is not defined. So if we mouse over this new function, we can see that it returns a type of any. So we must set which type this function returns because we have not used the strict mode. So the way we can see that this is a problem is, let's say I make a variable called s, and this variable is a string, and I'm going to equal to the new function. And we can see that we don't get no error because it believes that this new function can return of any type, which could be a string. So in order to define the type of this new function, over here, I'm going to place a colon and place in the type. And if we remember, this returns a vector3, which is a table with a x, y, and z numbers. So just like over there, I'm going to copy and paste this over here. And this is going to inform the type checker that this function is going to return a table with an x, y, and z keys that are numbers. And now if we go back to this script and make an update, so it updates, now we can see that we get an error. And now if we mouse over the new function, we can see that unlike before where it used to say any, it now says it returns a table with the keys of x, y, and z, which are equal to numbers. Okay, so now that we've defined what this function over here is going to return, let's now define the type of this function, which is going to be this pet, which is of this type. So let's copy and paste this over here. So now we can say that this function returns a type of a table with a position key, which is also a table with the keys of x, y, and z, which are numbers. So now that we've completed our two modules, let's slightly improve them. So one thing we can do is, here we can see we're using the same type over and over again. So what we can do is we can give this type a name and reference this type using its name. So at the top over here, I'm going to say type, and I can give it any name I like. So I'm going to call it my vector3 equals, and I'm going to have it equal to this type that we created. And now, instead of having to type this every time we want to use this type, we can just use it with its name, like so, and the same over here. Now, if we look over at our pet module, we can see that we're using the myVector3 type over here and over here. But how can we access this type from a different module? What we need to do is we need to export this type. So in order to export it, all we need to do is say export type. And now we can access this type through the module. So over here, what I'm going to do is replace this with v3.myvector3. And I'm going to do the same over here, like so. So now we can access this type by using export over on this module, like so. And just like we created a type over here, it's probably best to create a pet type over here. So at the top over here, I'm going to say type, and I'm going to name this type pet equals, and it's going to be equal to this. And I'm going to reference this type with its name, like so. Okay, so now that we've finished these two modules, what I'm going to do is move these two modules to the side so they're not in the way. And now inside of our script, I'm going to require the pet module. So at the top, I'm going to say local pet equals require game.serverstorage.pet. And now I'm going to use the new function to create a pet. So I'm going to say local new pet equals pet.new. Now, because we're not using strict, it's not going to infer that this is a pet object. And if we mouse over new pet, we can see it's of type any, which is not correct. We need to set the type of this pet. So just like we did here when we exported the vector3 type, we also need to export the pet type so that we can set this new pet to this pet type. So just like over here, I'm going to export the pet, and then I'm going to set this to the pet.pet type. And now if we mouse over new pet, we can see it says position with the X, Y, and Z coordinates. And now I can say new pet dot position. And if we looked at the autocomplete, we can see it says my vector3, which is the same name we gave it over here. And then I can set any axes I want. So for instance, I want to set the Y axis. And if I make a mistake and set it to a string, we should see we get a warning saying that it's not able to be a string and it needs to be a number. So if I change it back to a number, the warning should go away. Up until now, we've been using non-strict mode, but I personally think that strict is better than non-strict. So let's change the mode of all our scripts to strict, and let me show you the differences. So because we're now using strict, strict is going to be able to infer that this function returns a pet type. So we don't have to manually set the pet type. So I can remove this and it doesn't say any, but still says the position with the X, Y, and Z coordinates. Another thing we don't need to do no more is we no longer need to export the pet because the strict mode is going to be able to get the type even without exporting it. The next thing we no longer need to do is we no longer need to say what type this function returns, because in strict mode it's going to be able to infer that this is a pet type, and because we're returning the pet type, it's going to infer that this function returns a pet type. And the same is true over here. So we don't need to tell it that this function is going to return a vector3 because the strict mode is going to be able to infer that this function returns a vector3 type. And finally, in strict mode, we don't even have to create our types. So I can remove this and I can just simply return the table instantly, like so, and the same over here, and return this table instantly like this. And now it's going to infer that these are numbers, and it's going to infer that this is this function, which knows that these are numbers. And finally, if we look over here, we go new pet dot, we can see that position is equal to these three numbers. And if we go to X, Y, and Z, we can see that they're numbers. And if I try to set one to a string, it's going to give us a warning because it knows it should be a number. And if we change it to a number, the warning goes away. Thank you for watching my video, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below.